Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a pretty wild historical paradox from the exact night America entered the Second World War. We're going to unpack this highly specific, kind of crazy moment where absolutely catastrophic news was met in secret with a profound, quiet relief. And as we'll see, it was all driven by the cold, hard mathematics of global conflict.
So, let's open our story right in the middle of the action. Picture the scene. It's the dinner table at Chequers, the British Prime Minister's country house. The date is the evening of December 7th, 1941. Winston Churchill is sitting there with his American guests, including President Roosevelt's special envoy, Averell Harriman, and Ambassador John Gilbert Winnet. All of a sudden, a portable wireless set is brought into the room, and the news breaks. The American naval base at Pearl Harbor has just been bombed. A devastating attack on his closest ally has occurred, thousands of lives are lost, and yet, Churchill responds like a man whose deepest prayers have literally just been answered. But why?
Now, if you look at Churchill's exact phrasing here, slept the sleep of the saved and thankful, what's really fascinating is that he actually chose those specific words 8 years later in his memoirs. He wasn't just frantically scribbling a diary entry that night while making emergency transatlantic calls to the White House. No, looking back, he was capturing the profound underlying reality of that moment. The sheer serenity of that sentence tells us exactly what he instantly recognized in that dining room. His country was finally going to survive.
To really get why he felt this overwhelming relief, we have to rewind and look at the preceding 18 months of just sheer desperation for Britain. Since Churchill took office in May 1940, it had been a relentless series of crushing military disasters. France completely falls in June. The Battle of Britain rages through the summer and fall. And by early 1941, the Battle of the Atlantic is absolutely shredding their vital supply lines. Through all of this, Churchill was locked in this frantic, totally secret correspondence with President Roosevelt, sending hundreds of carefully crafted letters, basically trying to woo the United States to step into the fray.
Because at this point, Britain was quite literally bleeding dry. The numbers are staggering, and they paint a really grim picture. During the Blitz, more than 40,000 British civilians died. In 1941 alone, over 1,300 ships were lost to German U-boats, sending critical supplies straight to the bottom of the ocean. Their gold reserves almost completely wiped out, and the British people were surviving on the absolute strictest of rations. We're talking just 1 egg a week, with kids eating raw carrots on sticks because there wasn't any ice cream. Churchill had run the numbers over and over. He knew that while Britain could tough it out and endure the suffering, they absolutely, mathematically, could not win this total war without the United States.
Now, Roosevelt didn't just ignore this desperation. He answered the call with the Lend-Lease program, which provided this monumental, desperate lifeline of weapons and supplies to Britain and the other allies. This amounted to over $50 billion worth of aid. To put that into perspective, that's roughly $700 billion in today's money. But, even with that massive infusion of material, it just wasn't enough to entirely tip the scales. Having material help is incredible, sure, but it's just not the same as having American soldiers, sailors, and factories fully, 100% committed to the fight.
The sheer depth of that desperation makes this particular promise from Roosevelt's special envoy, Harry Hopkins, deeply moving. On a visit to assess British morale, Hopkins stood up at a dinner in Glasgow and quoted the Book of Ruth, saying, "Whither thou goest, I will go, even to the end." It famously brought Churchill to tears. I mean, he had been waiting 18 grueling months for an American to say something with that level of commitment. Yet, even this immense moral support wasn't the formal, full American entry into the war that Britain so desperately needed to actually secure a victory.
And leading up to December, Churchill was absolutely terrified of the approaching storm over in the Pacific. He dreaded this one very specific, nightmarish scenario. What if Japan attacked the British Empire, say, hitting places like Singapore, Hong Kong, or India, while America just remained entirely neutral? The Royal Navy was already being stretched to the breaking point trying to survive in the Atlantic. They simply didn't have the ships, the manpower, or the resources to defend 2 oceans at once. For the British Empire, a scenario like that would be genuinely catastrophic.
Well, then the storm finally broke. Pearl Harbor. The attack devastated the Pacific Fleet in a matter of hours. 8 battleships hit. 188 aircraft destroyed on the tarmac before they could even take off. 2,403 Americans killed. When this horrific news reached the dinner table at Chequers, it deeply shocked Ambassador Winnet and left the American public in a state of sudden rage and really profound grief. It was an absolutely unmitigated disaster for the U.S. military.
But look at the stark contrast in how 2 key figures reacted to this. It's fascinating. Both of these men completely understood the long-term reality of what had just happened.
While Churchill felt this immediate sense of relief, the actual architect of the Japanese attack, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, sat sunk in deep depression while his own staff was popping champagne and celebrating around him. Why? Well, Yamamoto had actually studied at Harvard. He had toured Detroit auto plants. Both he and Churchill fully grasped the long arithmetic of total war. They knew exactly what was about to happen next.
Yamamoto's dread was entirely rooted in cold, hard math. In 1941, the United States was already producing more industrial output than Germany and Japan combined. Its gross national product was literally more than twice the size of those two hostile economies put together. To give you an idea, just the American auto industry alone had built over 3 million vehicles that year. Turning that massive, relentless assembly line toward war production, that was going to fundamentally change the entire global equation.
This staggering industrial destiny meant that by the end of the conflict, the United States would account for a massive 40% of the entire globe's industrial output, almost half the world's production. It's a scale that the Axis powers simply could not match. I mean, even if they combined every single factory, shipyard, and resource they had at their disposal. The American material advantage was just completely insurmountable.
Just look at the sheer explosion of military potential here. 300,000! Get this, before the war, back in 1939, the U.S. built fewer than 3,000 military planes. In fact, their entire army was smaller than Portugal's, but by the war's end, American factories would churn out roughly 300,000 military aircraft. Early on, German strategists mocked them as this soft nation of commerce, but they so rapidly transformed into an absolutely unstoppable industrial juggernaut.
Churchill actually recalled a really vivid analogy from a former British Foreign Secretary, Edward Grey, before the First World War. He said the United States is like a gigantic boiler. Once the fire is lighted under it, there is no limit to the power it can generate. Sitting there on the morning of December 7th, Churchill realized the profound, terrifying truth of that statement. The fire beneath the American boiler had irrevocably been lighted by the attack on Pearl Harbor, and for sure there was going to be absolutely no limit to the power it would generate.
So why did Churchill feel deep in his bones that he had won the war that very night? Well, it essentially boiled down to a three-part equation in his head that, frankly, no one else at that table fully grasped all at once. First, he intimately knew the real depths of British military and economic exhaustion. Second, thanks to the Lend-Lease program, he had precise data on the massive scale of U.S. industrial capacity. And third, he instantly grasped the new political reality. Pearl Harbor completely silenced the American isolationists overnight. America was now in the war, fully, completely, and unquestionably united.
And from there, the Grand Alliance fell into place with just remarkable speed. Only 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler made this huge, fatal miscalculation based on his own twisted racial theories, and actually declared war on the U.S., totally saving Roosevelt from what would have been a really tricky political battle with Congress. This seamlessly paved the way for Churchill to cross the ocean, stay at the White House for weeks, and lock in the Germany First strategy at the Arcadia Conference. By January 1, 1942, the foundational framework for the United Nations was officially born.
Now, don't get me wrong, the road ahead was still incredibly brutal. In early 1942, Britain suffered some terrible disasters, like the sinking of the Prince of Wales, which is actually the very ship that had taken Churchill to meet Roosevelt earlier, and the catastrophic fall of Singapore, which to this day remains the worst single defeat in British military history. Yet, through all of that, Churchill's underlying confidence never wavered. Why? Because the core mathematical equation of victory was now solidly, irreversibly in the Allies' favor. Despite the setbacks, the math just hadn't changed.
You can see this immense relief perfectly captured in Churchill's unedited original manuscript about that night at Chequers. Originally, he wrote that his American guests nearly danced for joy upon hearing the news, before he smartly crossed that out to be a bit more diplomatic in print. But he left in this profound thought, delivered from a long pain. It's so telling, right? It reveals the unspoken relief that was secretly shared by the Americans in that room, because they too had carried the heavy burden of watching Britain struggle all alone, and that burden had just been lifted by the absolute worst possible means.
As we wrap up this explainer, we're really left with a profound question about the true cost of conflict. Churchill knew the war was arithmetically winnable on December 7th, but the sheer arithmetics of power, recognized in that single dining room, dictated a massive cost in blood across beaches and islands all around the globe. Ultimately, it forged the entire structure of our post-war world. So the next time you look at global alliances, ask yourself, how much of our modern world was built on the cold mathematics calculated in a single, quiet hour of history?